A destitute widow's desperate search for water on the scorched Oregon borderlands shatters when Sarah Brennan hears an infant's dying wail rising from beneath the earth in 1873. She tears through packed soil with bleeding hands to uncover a Modoc war chief buried alive, his newborn son Makya clutched against his chest, both left to suffocate by vengeful militia sworn to erase their bloodline. Driven by a mother's memory and raw humanity, Sarah risks her own survival to pull them from their living grave, igniting a hunt across a merciless land where compassion brands you an enemy and one woman's defiance could rewrite the rules of a savage frontier. The high desert of southern Oregon burned under an unforgiving sun in late August of 1873. The kind of heat that made the horizon shimmer like water that was never there. Sarah Brennan, 31 years old and worn beyond her years, dragged a wooden bucket toward what remained of bitter springs, a pathetic trickle that used to run strong before the drought strangled the land. Her dress, once a respectable calico blue, now hung in sun-bleached tatters, patched so many times the original fabric was hard to find beneath the repairs. Dust caked her auburn hair, pulled back in a loose braid that hadn't seen a proper washing in weeks, and her hands told the story of her life in calluses, cracked skin and scars from barbed wire and hot metal. 3 years had passed since her husband Thomas died from a fever that swept through the settlement of Lakeview, leaving her with 40 acres of stubborn earth, a one-room cabin that leaked when it rained, and debts that grew like weeds no matter how hard she worked. The townspeople had offered their condolences at first, bringing casseroles and kind words. But charity dried up faster than the creek beds when they realized she had no money and no prospects. Now they whispered about her behind cupped hands at the general store, calling her stubborn, foolish, maybe touched in the head for refusing to sell her land to Fletcher Gaines, the cattle baron who'd been buying up every failed homestead from here to the California line. Sarah didn't care what they said anymore. She'd stopped caring about a lot of things after she buried her daughter Emily 2 months after Thomas passed, the fever taking her baby girl before her 5th birthday, leaving Sarah with nothing but graves and memories and a plot of land that fought her every single day. Her boots, held together with rawhide strips and prayers, crunched across the alkali flats as she made her way toward the springs. The bucket handle bit into her palm, the wood worn smooth by years of the same journey, the same desperate hope that today there'd be enough water to keep her 3 scrawny chickens alive and maybe fill her own canteen. The landscape stretched out in every direction, like a painting done in shades of brown and gray, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional twisted juniper that somehow found purchase in the rocky soil. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding patches of snow that mocked the parched valleys below. Too far away to matter, too beautiful to ignore. This was Modoc country, or it had been before the wars. Sarah had heard the stories from the old-timers who gathered at Stockton's saloon. Tales of the Modoc people who'd lived on these lands for generations before white settlers arrived with their claims and their cattle and their absolute certainty that this empty country needed civilizing. The Modoc had fought back, of course, led by warriors whose names the settlers spoke with grudging respect mixed with fear. But the wars were over now, or so everyone said. The Modoc had been rounded up, sent to reservations up north, where the government promised them land and supplies that never quite materialized in full, and the settlers moved in to take what had been left behind. Sarah had never had strong feelings about it one way or another. She'd been too busy trying to survive, too focused on keeping Thomas alive and then grieving him, too consumed with watching her daughter waste away, to spend much time thinking about who had rights to what piece of this godforsaken desert. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind howled through the gaps in her cabin walls, she wondered if the land itself remembered who it belonged to. If the earth held grudges against those who'd taken it by force. A sound stopped her mid-step, so faint she almost missed it beneath the constant whisper of wind through sage. Sarah froze, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. The bucket hanging forgotten from her hand. There it was again, thin and desperate. A cry that pierced through the afternoon heat, like a needle through cloth. It was a baby, she knew that sound in her bones. Had spent enough sleepless nights with Emily to recognize the particular pitch of an infant in distress. But that made no sense. There were no homesteads within 5 miles of here. No reason for anyone to be out in this wasteland with a child, especially not in this heat. The cry came again, weaker now, choked and fading, and Sarah felt her body move before her mind caught up. She dropped the bucket and ran toward the sound, her boots slipping on loose rocks, her breath coming hard in the thin air. The crying seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the rocky outcrops and scrub, leading her in circles until she crested a small rise and saw it. A patch of disturbed earth in a shallow depression maybe 20 feet across. The dirt dark and recently turned, despite the bone-dry conditions everywhere else. Sarah's stomach dropped. Fresh digging in country this remote meant only one thing. Someone had buried something they didn't want found. The infant's wail rose again, muffled but unmistakable. Coming from beneath that turned soil, her hands flew to her mouth as the full horror hit her. Someone had buried a baby alive. Sarah skidded down the slope, falling to her knees beside the disturbed earth, her hands already tearing at the packed soil. The ground was hard, compressed by boots and maybe shovels, but not filled in properly, as if whoever did this had been in a hurry or simply didn't care enough to do a thorough job. Her fingernails broke, blood welling up beneath them as she clawed through the first layer, and then she saw it. A tiny hand, no bigger than a corn cob, fingers curled into a desperate fist, thrust up through the dirt as if reaching for sky it would never see. Sarah's breath caught in a sob as she dug faster, ignoring the pain in her hands, ignoring everything except the need to reach that child. The crying had stopped. That terrified her more than anything. The sudden silence that might mean she was already too late, that she was digging up a corpse instead of saving a life. More of the hand appeared, then a thin arm wrapped in what looked like deerskin, then the curve of a small shoulder. Sarah's fingers found fabric and she grabbed hold, pulling with strength born of pure desperation. The earth gave way, and suddenly she was holding a baby, maybe 3 months old, covered in dirt but breathing, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. The infant's eyes opened, dark and unfocused, his face scrunched in confusion and terror. Sarah pulled him to her chest, brushing dirt from his nose and mouth, her own tears cutting clean tracks down her dusty cheeks. The baby coughed, a wet rattling sound, and then drew in a huge breath and screamed, the healthiest sound Sarah had heard in months. She clutched him close, rocking back and forth on her knees, murmuring nonsense words of comfort, while her mind tried to process what she'd found. The baby wore traditional Modoc clothing, soft deerskin decorated with small beads, now covered in grave dirt. His black hair was fine and silky, his skin the warm brown of the Modoc people, and his cries had the strong, furious quality of a child who hadn't been sick or starving before someone tried to kill him. Sarah's hands shook as she held him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who would do this? The question had barely formed when she noticed the depression wasn't just a shallow hole. It was bigger than it needed to be for one small baby. Still cradling the infant against her shoulder, Sarah leaned forward and saw what she'd missed in her panic. Another hand, this one much larger, thrust up through the dirt about 2 feet from where she'd found the baby. This hand was clenched around something, the knuckles white with effort even in death or unconsciousness. Sarah's blood ran cold. There was someone else down there. She laid the baby gently on a patch of relatively clean ground, making sure he was still breathing, still crying his healthy, furious cry. And then she attacked the earth again. This time she knew what she was looking for, and her hands moved with purpose, scooping away dirt in great handfuls, revealing an arm, then a shoulder, then the broad back of a man buried face down in the soil. He was huge, easily 6 feet tall and powerfully built, wearing the remnants of traditional Modoc clothing and what looked like a military jacket. Stolen or traded, now torn and filthy, his long black hair was braided and wrapped with leather cord, and even covered in dirt, Sarah could see the scars that marked his arms and back, the evidence of a warrior's life. She dug around his head, terrified of what she'd find, expecting the slack features of a corpse. But when she finally cleared the dirt from his face, his eyes snapped open. Sarah screamed and fell backward, her heart nearly stopping. The man's eyes were black as obsidian and filled with a rage so pure it seemed to burn. His face was lean and hard, marked with ritual scars along his cheekbones, and his jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. He was alive, buried up to his neck with his infant son, left to suffocate slowly in the earth. And somehow, impossibly, he was still alive. The man's lips moved, cracked and bleeding, forming words Sarah couldn't hear. She leaned closer, her fear warring with the same stubborn compassion that had made her dig up the baby in the first place. His voice was a rasping whisper, barely human after however long he'd been down there. "My son," he managed, his eyes rolling toward where the baby lay crying. Sarah understood immediately. This man had been buried alive holding his child, and even facing his own death, his only thought was for the baby. Something cracked open in Sarah's chest, some wall she'd built around her heart after losing Emily. "He's alive," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "Your son is alive. I've got him." The man's eyes closed, and for a horrible moment, Sarah thought he'd died right there. But then she saw his chest moving, shallow breaths that said he was hanging on by pure will. She had to get him out. Sarah dug like a woman possessed, her broken fingernails leaving bloody smears on the disturbed earth. The sun beat down mercilessly and sweat poured down her face. Mixing with tears, she didn't remember starting to cry. Whoever had done this had buried the man deep, his arms pinned at his sides. Only that one hand thrust up through the soil in a final act of defiance, still reaching for his son, even in what should have been his grave. It took forever, or maybe minutes. Time had stopped meaning anything. Sarah worked until her hands were raw meat, until her back screamed in agony, until finally she'd cleared enough dirt to grab the man under his arms. She pulled with everything she had, her boots digging into the loose soil for purchase. The earth didn't want to give him up, clinging to him like a jealous lover. But Sarah was beyond rational thought now. She pulled and heaved, and finally, with a wet sucking sound that would haunt her dreams, the man came free. He collapsed on the ground beside his still-crying son, his chest heaving as he dragged in great gasping breaths of air. Sarah fell to her knees between them, her own breathing ragged, her vision swimming with exhaustion and shock. For a long moment, the only sounds were the baby's cries, the man's labored breathing, and the eternal wind across the high desert. Then the man moved, faster than Sarah would have thought possible for someone who'd just been pulled from a grave. He rolled onto his side and gathered his son into his arms, holding the baby against his chest with a tenderness that seemed impossible from someone who looked so fierce. The infant quieted slightly at the familiar touch, his cries reducing to whimpers and hiccups. The man's shoulders shook, and Sarah realized with a start that he was weeping, silent tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face as he clutched his child. Sarah didn't move, didn't speak, just knelt there in the dirt watching this reunion she'd made possible. Finally, the man looked up at her, his dark eyes still fierce but now carrying something else. Recognition, perhaps, or acknowledgement. "Who are you?" he asked in English, marked by a heavy accent, but perfectly understandable. "Tante Senjo." "Sarah Brennan," she said, her voice hoarse. "I have a homestead about 3 miles west. I was heading to the spring for water when I heard your son crying." The man studied her, his gaze taking in her threadbare dress, her bleeding hands, the desperation that hung on her like a shroud. "I am Tanawa," he said finally, "of the Modoc people. This is my son Makya." Sarah nodded, not sure what else to do. "Who did this to you?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Tanawa's expression hardened, his jaw clenching. A militia, he spat the word like a curse, led by a man named Silas Crow. They said my family stole cattle, said we killed a settler's child. His arms tightened around Makya. Lies, all lies. But they don't need truth when hate serves them better. Sarah's stomach turned. She knew the name Silas Crow. Everyone in Lakeview did. He ran a vigilante group that claimed to protect settlers from Indian raids. But mostly, they just terrorized anyone who wasn't white and took whatever they wanted while calling it justice. The law looked the other way because Crow had money and influence. And because most people were too scared or too hateful to care what he did, they killed my wife, Tanawa continued. His voice flat with grief, shot her while she held our son. When I fought back, they decided burial would send a better message than hanging. His eyes met Sarah's. They wanted us to disappear, wanted no graves for my people to find. No evidence of their crime. Sarah felt sick. This wasn't war. Wasn't even the brutal frontier justice she'd grown used to. This was calculated cruelty, the kind that required planning and cold blood. How long were you down there? She asked. Tanawa looked at the sky, gauging the sun's position. Since dawn, he said. Maybe 8 hours. They buried Makya first, shallow, so I could hear him cry before I died. His voice cracked. They wanted that to be the last thing I heard. Sarah's hands clenched into fists despite the pain. 8 hours. This man had been buried alive for 8 hours, listening to his infant son suffocate, unable to move or help or even reach him. They'll come back, Tanawa said, struggling to sit up, his body clearly racked with pain. At sunset, to make sure we're dead. And when they find us gone, he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Sarah looked at the disturbed earth. The evidence of her rescue scattered everywhere. There was no hiding what she'd done. When Crow and his men returned, they'd know someone had interfered and they'd come looking. Her homestead was the closest building for miles. They'd come to her first. Sarah thought of her cabin, her small plot of land, the graves of her husband and daughter. Everything she had left in this world could fit in a single wagon. She thought of Fletcher Gaines and his offers to buy her out, thought of starting over, somewhere else, somewhere safer. Then she looked at Tanawa, at the baby Makya sleeping now in his father's arms, at the raw earth of a grave that should have been final. She thought of Emily, of holding her daughter as fever burned her up from the inside, of being helpless to save her own child, but she wasn't helpless now. My cabin, Sarah said, standing up on shaking legs. It's not much, but it's shelter. We need to move before they come back. Tanawa stared at her, suspicion and hope warring in his expression. Why would you help us? He asked. You're risking everything. For strangers, for Modoc. Sarah looked at him, this fierce warrior holding his baby with such gentleness, and she thought about all the ways the world had broken her heart. Because someone buried a baby alive, she said simply. And I'll be damned if I let that stand. Tanawa studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face for deception or hidden motives. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly and began the painful process of standing. His legs nearly buckled, and Sarah moved quickly to support him, slinging his free arm over her shoulders. He was heavy, solid muscle and bone, and she was already exhausted. But she gritted her teeth and took his weight. They moved slowly across the alkali flats, Sarah guiding them toward her distant cabin while constantly scanning the horizon for signs of riders. The sun was already past its peak, sliding toward the western mountains, and she knew they had maybe 4 hours before Crow returned to check his handiwork. Maybe less if he was eager to confirm his victims were dead. Tanawa's breathing was labored, each step clearly agony, but he didn't complain, didn't slow them down. Makya dozed against his chest, the trauma of his near death already fading into infant sleep. Trusting completely in his father's arms, Sarah felt a pang in her chest watching them, remembering how Emily used to fall asleep just like that. Her small body relaxed and warm. She pushed the memory away, focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The cabin appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its weathered boards grey against the brown landscape. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof that leaked. But right now, it looked like salvation. Sarah's chickens scattered as they approached, squawking indignantly at the disturbance. She kicked open the door and helped Tanawa inside, guiding him to her one chair. A rickety thing Thomas had made their first year here. The cabin was a single room, maybe 12 feet square, with a cast-iron stove in one corner, a narrow bed in another, and precious little else. A shelf held her few dishes and the remaining supplies from her last trip to town. The walls were bare, except for a single daguerreotype of Thomas and Emily, their faces frozen in the formal poses of the photography studio. Tanawa sank into the chair with a groan, still cradling Makya. The baby was starting to fuss again, probably hungry, and Sarah's mind raced through the practical problems. She had no milk, no way to feed an infant. "He needs food," she said, stating the obvious. Tanawa nodded, his face grim. "My wife was nursing him," he said quietly. "There was a woman in our camp who might have helped." But he didn't finish. The camp was gone. His wife was dead. Everyone was scattered or dead or imprisoned. Sarah thought hard, digging through her memories of raising Emily. "Sugar water," she said finally, "and broth if I can make it thin enough. It's not ideal, but it'll keep him alive until we figure something better." She moved to her stove, building up the fire with precious kindling. Setting a pot of water to boil, her hands shook as she worked, exhaustion and shock finally catching up with her. She dug 2 people out of a grave today, people who were now sitting in her cabin, and in a few hours armed men would come looking for them. What had she done? The question whispered through her mind, but she pushed it away. She knew what she'd done, and she'd do it again. The water boiled, and she mixed in a tiny bit of precious sugar, letting it cool before soaking a clean cloth in the mixture. Tanawa took it gratefully, holding it to Makya's lips. The baby sucked hungrily at the cloth, his small hands waving. It wasn't enough. Wouldn't be enough for long, but it was something. Sarah watched them for a moment, then turned to rummage through her supplies. She had maybe 2 weeks' worth of food if she was careful. Some dried beans, a little flour, a precious can of peaches she'd been saving for a special occasion that never came. Not enough for 3 people, especially not if they had to run. Her mind was already working through the problems. Crow would come at sunset, find the empty grave, track them here. They couldn't fight. She had Thomas's old rifle, but only a handful of bullets. And Tanawa was in no shape for a battle. They had to run, had to get far enough away that Crow couldn't find them. But where could they go? North to the reservation lands meant Tanawa might find his people. But it was weeks of travel through hostile territory. West to California meant crossing mountains with winter coming on. South meant Arizona territory and more settlers who'd ask questions. East led back toward Lakeview and certain death. There were no good options, only degrees of impossible. Sarah's head ached and her hands throbbed, and she wanted nothing more than to collapse on her bed and sleep for a week. But she couldn't, not yet. "We'll leave at dusk," she said, making the decision as she spoke. "Pack light, move fast. Head north toward the lava beds." Tanawa looked up sharply at that. "The stronghold," he said, and something flickered in his eyes. Sarah nodded. She'd heard stories of Captain Jack's stronghold in the lava beds, the natural fortress where Modoc warriors had held off the U.S. Army for months. It was dangerous territory, full of hidden caves and treacherous rock, but that same terrain would make it nearly impossible for Crow to track them. "Can you make it that far?" she asked. Tanawa's jaw set in determination. "I will make it," he said, and she believed him. Sarah began gathering supplies, moving with purpose now that she had a plan. She filled her canteen, wrapped the remaining food in cloth, found an old blanket for Makya. Her fingers hesitated over the daguerreotype of her family. She picked it up, studied their faces one last time, then carefully tucked it into her pocket. Some things you didn't leave behind, outside. The sun continued its slide toward evening, and somewhere out in the desert, Silas Crow was riding toward an empty grave and the rage that would follow. The shadows grew long across Sarah Brennan's homestead as she stuffed supplies into a canvas sack with trembling hands, her mind racing through calculations of distance and danger. Tanawa sat in her rickety chair, his breathing steadier now, but his body clearly racked with pain from hours compressed in the earth. Makia had fallen into an exhausted sleep against his father's chest. The sugar water enough to quiet his hunger for now, but Sarah knew it wouldn't last. She grabbed Thomas's old rifle from where it hung above the door, checking the chamber with practiced motions her husband had taught her years ago. 4 bullets. That was all she had. 4 chances to defend themselves against however many men Silas Crow would bring. The mathematics of survival weren't promising. Sarah shoved the rifle into the pack anyway, because even false comfort was better than none. Outside, her 3 chickens pecked at the hard ground. Oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding around them, she'd raised those birds from chicks, had given them names like foolish pets, Henrietta and Mabel and Bess. Now she'd have to leave them behind. Let them scatter to the coyotes or whatever else found them first. The thought brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Everything she'd built here, every scrap of normalcy she'd clawed together after Thomas and Emily died, was about to be abandoned for 2 strangers she'd known for less than an hour. But when she looked at Tanawa holding his sleeping son, she knew with bone-deep certainty that she'd made the only choice her conscience could live with. The sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. Maybe 2 hours until full dark, maybe less until Crow arrived. Sarah's hands moved faster, grabbing her one good blanket, a tin cup, matches wrapped in oilcloth. She paused at the small wooden box beside her bed, the one that held Emily's baby clothes and Thomas's pocket watch. Her fingers hovered over it, torn between sentiment and practicality. The box was too heavy, too bulky, would slow them down, but leaving it felt like abandoning her family all over again. Tanawa's voice cut through her paralysis. "Take only what keeps us alive," he said quietly. "Everything else is weight we cannot afford." His words were harsh, but his tone held understanding, the voice of someone who'd lost everything before and knew the terrible arithmetic of survival. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard, and left the box where it sat. She grabbed one of Emily's small dresses instead, soft yellow cotton with white flowers, and stuffed it in her pocket next to the daguerreotype. Small mercies, tiny rebellions against total loss. Tanawa was struggling to his feet when hoofbeats shattered the evening quiet. Sarah's blood turned to ice. They were out of time. She rushed to the window, peering through the gap in the boards, and her worst fears crystallized into reality. 6 riders approached from the east, their silhouettes dark against the sunset, moving at a steady trot that spoke of men who knew exactly where they were going. Even from a distance, she could make out Silas Crow leading them. His distinctive flat-crowned hat and the way he sat his horse like a judge approaching a sentencing. Behind him rode his lieutenant Marcus Webb, a cruel man with a talent for violence and no conscience to restrain it. The others were hired guns and ranch hands, men who followed Crow for money or blood sport or both. Sarah's mind raced. They couldn't run now, not with riders already this close. They'd be spotted immediately and run down in open country. They couldn't fight, not with 4 bullets against 6 rifles. That left hiding, and her tiny cabin offered exactly one place that might work. "The root cellar," she hissed, grabbing Tanawa's arm. He understood immediately and moved with her toward the trapdoor in the corner. Concealed under a threadbare rug, Sarah yanked it open, revealing a dirt hole, maybe 6 feet deep and 4 feet square. Barely big enough for 2 adults, let alone 3 people. It smelled of earth and potatoes and mice. Tanawa didn't hesitate, climbing down into the darkness with Makia still clutched to his chest. Sarah threw their supply pack down after him, then grabbed handfuls of dried sage from her kindling pile and scattered it across the floor to mask any scent. The hoofbeats were louder now. Maybe 100 yards out, she dropped into the cellar, pulling the trapdoor closed above her head just as voices reached the cabin. The darkness was absolute, pressing in like a physical weight. Sarah's heart hammered so loud she was certain the men outside could hear it. Above them, boots hit the porch boards with heavy thuds. "Mrs. Brennan," Crow's voice called out, deceptively pleasant. "We need a word if you're home." Sarah held her breath, pressed against the damp earth wall, feeling Tanawa's solid presence beside her. Makia stirred and Sarah's stomach clenched. If the baby cried now, they were dead. Tanawa's hand found his son's head in the darkness, gently stroking, a touch so tender it made Sarah's chest ache. The baby settled, sensing his father's calm. More footsteps above. Circling the cabin. "She ain't here." "Boss?" a rough voice said. "Marcus Webb by the sound of it." "Check inside," Crow ordered. The door crashed open and Sarah jumped despite herself. Boots stomped across her floor, directly over their heads. Dust filtered down through the gaps in the floorboards, tickling her nose. She pressed her hand over her mouth and nose, desperate not to sneeze. "Place is a damn mess," Webb said. "It looks like she left in a hurry, or someone took her," another voice suggested. Sarah's mind whirled. They didn't know she was here. Thought she'd already fled. That bought them time, maybe, if she could just stay silent. "Check the property," Crow said. "Barn, chicken coop, everything." More boots. Spreading out, searching. Sarah could hear them overturning her meager possessions, the crash of her dishes hitting the floor, the scrape of furniture being moved. Then Webb's voice again, closer now. "Right above the trapdoor. What about this rug?" "Boss." Sarah's blood froze. Tanawa's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezed once, a gesture of solidarity or farewell. She couldn't tell which. The rug scraped across the floor. This was it. They were discovered. She had seconds to decide whether to surrender or fight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her hand moved toward the rifle. Then Crow's voice cut through. "Leave it. We're wasting time here." "But boss," Webb protested. "I said leave it," Crow snapped. "The woman's not here and neither are our bodies." "Bodies." So they'd already checked the grave. "Found it empty." "Someone dug them out," Webb said. "Tracks everywhere. Looked like maybe one person. Probably a woman from the boot size." Sarah's stomach dropped. They knew someone had freed Tanawa and Makia, and they were smart enough to connect it to the nearest homestead. "Could be the Brennan woman," Crow mused. Always was a soft-hearted fool. "Taking in strays and feeding drifters," his voice hardened. "Find her, and you'll find our escaped savages." The boots moved toward the door. "What about the cabin, boss?" someone asked. "Burn it." Sarah's fingernails dug into her palms. A long pause that stretched like torture. Then Crow spoke, and Sarah could hear the cold calculation in his voice. "No, leave it standing," he said. "She'll come back eventually, everyone does. To collect their treasures or say goodbye to their ghosts." His boots hit the porch. "We'll set a watch rotation, 2 men at a time. Hidden in those rocks a quarter-mile east," he continued. "When she returns, we take her, and she'll tell us where the Indian and his whelp ran to. Clever." Sarah thought bitterly, too clever. Crow wasn't just hunting them. He was laying traps. The horses moved away, the sound of hoofbeats gradually fading into the evening. Sarah stayed frozen, counting her heartbeats, making herself wait beside her in the darkness. Tanawa was equally still, equally patient. They'd both learned the hard way that rushing led to graves. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Sarah whispered, "They're watching the cabin." "We can't leave the way we came." Tanawa's voice came back, barely audible. "How deep does this cellar go?" Sarah understood his thinking immediately. "There's no tunnel if that's what you're asking," she said. "But the back wall is only dirt, poorly packed. I used to joke with Thomas about it being more hole than cellar. Can we dig through?" Tanawa asked. Sarah considered. The back wall faced north, toward the open range and eventually the lava beds. If they could break through quietly, they might crawl out beyond sight of Crow's watchers. It was desperate and dangerous and probably impossible. "We can try," she said. They worked in absolute silence. Tanawa passing Makia to Sarah while he attacked the back wall with his bare hands. The earth was hard-packed but old. crumbling under determined pressure. Sarah held the baby close, one hand over his mouth ready to stifle any cries. While she listened with every fiber of her being for sounds of discovery above, the cabin remained quiet except for the normal settling of old wood. Tanawa dug like a man possessed, his breath coming in controlled gasps, and gradually a hole appeared, small at first, then larger, until finally cool night air rushed in, carrying the scent of sage and freedom. Tanawa pushed through first, wriggling like a snake, then reached back for Makya. Sarah handed him the baby with infinite care, then grabbed their supply pack and followed. The hole was barely wide enough, the earth scraping her shoulders raw, but she forced herself through into the blessed relief of open air. They'd emerged behind the cabin, the building itself blocking them from the sight line of Crow's watchers. The sky was full dark now, stars beginning to emerge, and the temperature was already dropping toward the bitter cold of a high desert night. Tanawa moved immediately, staying low, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. Sarah followed, her boots making soft crunching sounds on the hard ground that seemed deafening to her terrified ears. They made it 50 yards, then 100, putting distance between themselves and the cabin. Behind them, Sarah could just make out the dark shapes of rocks where Crow's men lay waiting. Another 50 yards and they dropped into a dry wash, finally out of direct sight. Only then did Sarah allow herself to breathe properly. They'd escaped impossibly, but they'd escaped. Tanawa settled Makya against his shoulder and looked at Sarah with something approaching respect. "You think fast," he said quietly. Sarah almost laughed. A slightly hysterical sound she choked back. "I've had practice," she said, thinking of all the times she'd scrambled to keep her homestead running, to stay one step ahead of creditors and catastrophe. Makya whimpered, and Sarah dug through the pack for the sugar water. The baby drank greedily, but it was clear he needed real food soon. "There's a trading post," Sarah said, thinking out loud, about 20 miles north, run by a half-Klamath woman named Ada Whitfield. She paused. "Considering Ada has goats, sells milk and cheese, and she's got no love for Crow's kind," Sarah continued. "If we can make it there by tomorrow night, we'll have to travel during daylight," Tanawa interrupted, his voice grim. "This country is too dangerous to cross blind. Too many cliffs and holes." He was right, and Sarah knew it. The high desert was treacherous even in full sun. At night it was a death trap. "Then we move at first light," she said, "and pray Crow doesn't pick up our trail." They settled into the wash to wait for dawn, taking turns keeping watch while the other rested. Sarah took first shift, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and she found herself thinking about Emily, about Thomas, about all the choices that had led her to this exact moment. Crouched in a ditch with a Modoc warrior and his infant son, running from men who wanted them dead, with nothing but hope and 4 bullets between them and disaster. A year ago she would have called this madness. Now it felt like the first honest thing she'd done since she started digging graves. Tanawa shifted beside her, Makya sleeping peacefully in his arms. "Why did you really dig us out?" he asked softly, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, searching for words that could explain. "I had a daughter," she said finally. "Emily, she died 2 years ago from fever." She swallowed hard. "When I heard your son crying from under that earth, all I could think was that I couldn't save Emily, but maybe I could save him," she continued. "Maybe one mother's grief could prevent another's." Tanawa nodded slowly, understanding in his dark eyes. "My wife's name was Wenatchee," he said. "She died giving birth to Makya. Something tore inside that the medicine woman couldn't fix." His arms tightened around his son. "She made me promise to keep him safe, to make sure he grew up knowing his people's ways," he said, voice rough with grief. "Then Crow came with his lies and his guns." They sat in shared silence, 2 people bonded by loss and the desperate need to protect what little remained. The night deepened, and eventually Sarah's watch ended. She woke Tanawa with a gentle touch and settled down to sleep, using the supply pack as a pillow. But sleep came fitfully, broken by images of Emily's face and the sound of Makia's cries from beneath the earth. She woke before dawn to find Tanawa already up, studying the eastern horizon with the focused intensity of a man reading dangerous signs. "Storm coming," he said without looking at her. "Maybe 2 days out, but it'll be bad when it hits." Sarah followed his gaze and saw what he meant. The sky held a peculiar quality, a heaviness in the air that spoke of weather building beyond the mountains. "We need to be under cover when it breaks," she said, thinking of the exposure they'd face crossing open country. Tanawa nodded and began gathering their few possessions. Makia was awake now, fussing with the persistent hunger of a baby who needed real milk. Sarah mixed more sugar water, but the baby turned his head away, unsatisfied. "Ada's trading post," she said with more confidence than she felt. "We push hard, we can make it by nightfall." They climbed out of the wash as the first grey light touched the eastern peaks. The landscape stretched before them in rolling hills of sage and stone, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. Behind them, somewhere in those rocks, Crow's men waited for a woman who would never return. The thought gave Sarah a grim satisfaction. They walked north, Tanawa setting a pace that was fast but sustainable. Clearly a man who understood long-distance travel. Sarah struggled to keep up, her body already exhausted from the previous day's ordeal. Her hands throbbed where her fingernails had torn, and her shoulders ached from digging. But she gritted her teeth and matched his stride. The sun rose hot and merciless, turning the high desert into a furnace by mid-morning. They stopped briefly at a tiny seep spring, barely enough water to wet their lips and refill the canteen. Tanawa soaked a cloth and let Makia suck on it, trying to keep the baby hydrated. The child's cries had weakened, a bad sign that spoke of dangerous dehydration. "How much farther?" Tanawa asked, his voice tight with worry. Sarah scanned the horizon, trying to orient herself by landmarks she'd only visited a handful of times. 10 miles, maybe 12, she admitted. "I'm not certain." Tanawa's jaw tightened, but he nodded. They pushed on, the heat rising in shimmering waves that made the distant mountains dance. Around noon, Tanawa suddenly froze, his hand raised in warning. Sarah stopped immediately, her heart leaping into her throat. "Riders," he said quietly, pointing east. Sarah squinted against the glare and saw them, 3 dark shapes moving parallel to their course, about a mile distant. Too far to make out details, but the pattern of movement suggested searchers. "Crow's men," she breathed. Tanawa was already moving, angling toward a cluster of rocks that offered the only cover in sight. They ran, Sarah's boots slipping on loose stones, her breath coming in harsh gasps. Makia began to cry, the sound carrying across the open ground. Tanawa pressed the baby's face against his chest, muffling the noise. They reached the rocks and dove behind them just as one of the riders turned in their direction. Sarah pressed herself flat against sun-heated stone, her pulse hammering. Beside her, Tanawa had gone absolutely still, his body tense as a drawn bowstring. The riders came closer, their horses picking their way across the rough ground. Sarah could hear their voices now, rough and casual. "Ain't nothing out here but lizards and heat," one complained. "Crow says search, we search," another replied. "You want to tell him we gave up?" The first man muttered something Sarah couldn't catch. They were close now, maybe 50 yards, close enough that Sarah could see the rifles across their saddles. If the horses spooked at their scent, if Makia cried again, if any of 100 things went wrong. The riders paused, one of them scanning the rocks with narrowed eyes. Sarah held her breath, willing herself to become stone. Tanawa's hand found the knife at his belt. The only weapon he had. Against 3 rifles it was suicide, but she saw in his eyes that he'd fight anyway, go down protecting his son. The rider shook his head and turned away. "Nothing here," he called to his companions. "Let's check those hills to the west." They moved off, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust. Sarah waited until they disappeared over a rise before allowing herself to breathe. "That was too close," she whispered. Tanawa nodded, his face grim. "They're spreading out." "Searching in a pattern," he said. "Professional, organized." He looked at Sarah. "Crow's not giving up," he continued. "He'll keep searching until he finds us, or we get so far away he can't follow." Sarah's mind raced through their options. They couldn't keep moving in open country, not with searchers this close. But they couldn't stay here either. Makya needed food and water soon, or he'd die. "There's another way," she said slowly, an idea forming. "Rougher country, harder to track through." She pointed northwest, toward a line of broken hills. "Old mining country," she explained, "played out 20 years ago, full of abandoned tunnels and claims." Tanawa considered this. "Harder for them to search," he agreed, "but also harder for us to travel." "And it'll take us out of our way," Sarah admitted. "At maybe 6 hours to reach Ada's." They looked at each other, weighing impossible choices. Finally, Tanawa shifted Makya in his arms. "The boy needs food," he said, "but he needs us alive to get it." Sarah nodded. "The mines it is," she said. They waited until the searchers had moved well past, then struck out northwest toward the broken country. The terrain grew rougher with each mile, the ground rising and falling in steep gullies. Old mine shafts appeared like wounds in the earth, their openings dark and dangerous. Sarah gave them wide berth, knowing that some were hundreds of feet deep. The sun was well past its peak when they finally entered the heart of the old mining district. Rusted equipment lay scattered like bones of some extinct creature. A collapsed head frame marked what had once been a productive claim, and everywhere the detritus of abandoned dreams. "We can rest here," Sarah said, pointing to a relatively intact mine office. Its roof still mostly whole. They took shelter in the shade, and Sarah used the last of their sugar to make another batch of sugar water. Makya took it listlessly, his tiny body alarmingly limp. Tanawa's face was tight with controlled panic. "He's fading," he said quietly. Sarah knew it was true. The baby needed real food soon, or no amount of running would matter. "We move again in an hour," she said. "Push through until we reach Ada's." She met Tanawa's eyes. "Your son will make it," she said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I didn't dig him out of the ground just to lose him to hunger." Tanawa nodded, gratitude and desperation warring in his expression. The hour passed too quickly, and they were moving again, threading through the maze of the old mining district. The sun was setting when they finally emerged on the far side, and Sarah oriented herself by the distinctive shape of a distant peak. "Ada's is 3 miles that way," she said, pointing. They covered the distance as the last light faded, arriving at the trading post just as full dark descended. The building was sturdy log construction, with a corral and a few outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and life. Sarah approached the door with Tanawa hanging back in the shadows. She knocked, her heart in her throat. The door opened a crack and a rifle barrel emerged. "State your business," a woman's voice commanded. "Ada, it's Sarah Brennan," Sarah said quickly. "I need help." The door opened wider and Ada Whitfield appeared. A woman of about 40 with sharp eyes and the weathered face of someone who'd lived hard. Her gaze took in Sarah's disheveled state, then flicked to where Tanawa stood holding Makya. "Trouble," Ada said flatly. "The worst kind," Sarah agreed. Ada studied them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped back and opened the door wide. "Get inside," she said. "Before someone sees you." Ada Whitfield's trading post smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, a sanctuary of warmth after the brutal day of flight across open country. Sarah stumbled through the door with Tanawa close behind. and Ada bolted it shut immediately, dropping a heavy bar across the frame. The main room served as both store and living quarters, shelves lined with goods, a pot-bellied stove radiating heat, and a sleeping area partitioned off with a faded curtain. Ada moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to handling emergencies, gesturing toward a bench near the stove. "Sit," she commanded, then turned her attention to Makia, who lay limp and quiet in Tanawa's arms. Her experienced hands gently took the baby, unwrapping the deerskin swaddle to examine him. "Dehydrated and starving," she said, her voice clinical but not unkind. "How long since he's had proper milk?" 2 days, Tanawa said, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear. Ada's mouth tightened into a grim line. "That's too long for one so young," she said, already moving toward the back room. "I've got a nanny goat that just kidded. Milk's rich and fresh." She disappeared through a doorway and returned moments later with a small glass bottle fitted with a rubber nipple. Filled with warm goat's milk, Makia latched onto it with desperate hunger, his tiny hands gripping the bottle as he drank. The sound of his frantic suckling filled the room, and Sarah felt her shoulders sag with relief she hadn't known she was holding. Ada watched the baby feed with a practiced eye, then turned her attention to Sarah and Tanawa. "You're running from Silas Crow," she stated, not a question. Sarah nodded, too tired to be surprised that Ada had figured it out so quickly. "The whole territory knows Crow's on a hunt," Ada continued, settling into a worn chair. "Word came through yesterday that he found an empty grave and was offering $50 for information about a white woman and a Modoc man with a baby." She fixed Sarah with a penetrating stare. "That's good money in these parts," she said. "Enough to tempt most folks." Sarah's heart sank. $50 was a fortune out here, more than most people saw in 6 months. "Are you going to turn us in?" she asked quietly. Meeting Ada's eyes, Ada was silent for a long moment, studying them both. Finally she shook her head. "I've got no love for Crow or his kind," she said, her voice hard. "My first husband was Klamath. Good man, worked hard, never hurt a soul." She paused, old pain flickering across her weathered face. "Crow's men lynched him 10 years back. Claimed he stole a horse that was standing in his own corral," she continued. "Left him hanging from a cottonwood tree like a scarecrow." Her hands clenched into fists. "So no, I won't be turning you in," she said. "But you can't stay here long. Crow's men patrol past here regular, and if they search the place, we'll leave at first light," Sarah said quickly. "We just need supplies and maybe a few hours' rest." Ada nodded, then stood and moved to her shelves. "You'll need more than that," she said, pulling down various items. "Food that won't spoil, extra blankets, ammunition if you've got weapons." She glanced at Sarah's pack. "What are you carrying?" she asked. Sarah showed her the meager supplies. "The rifle with 4 bullets," Ada's eyebrows rose. "4 bullets against Crow and his whole crew," she said flatly. "You planning to talk the rest to death despite everything?" Sarah found herself smiling. "I was hoping to avoid them entirely," she admitted. Ada snorted and disappeared into a back room, returning with a small wooden box. 20 rounds for that rifle," she said, setting it down. "And take this." She produced a smaller pistol. "A Colt pocket model, 6 shots, easier to hide than that long gun," she explained, handing it to Sarah along with a box of cartridges. Sarah's throat tightened. "Ada, I can't pay for any of this," she said, shame coloring her voice. Ada waved her off. "Consider it payment of an old debt," she said. "The universe took from me. Now I'm giving back." She began packing supplies into a larger canvas sack, her movements quick and efficient. Dried meat, hardtack, a small sack of cornmeal, matches, a tin pot. "Where are you headed?" she asked as she worked. Tanawa spoke up for the first time since entering. "North to the lava beds," he said. "There are caves there. Places to hide until Crow gives up." Ada's hands paused. "The stronghold country," she said quietly. "That's rough territory. Especially with a baby. Everywhere is rough with a baby when men want you dead," Tanawa replied, his voice flat. Ada couldn't argue with that. She finished packing and set the heavy sack on the table. "There's enough here for 2 weeks if you're careful," she said. Who then added, "There's a line shack about 15 miles north. Belongs to a rancher named Dutch Keller." She pulled out a scrap of paper and drew a rough map. "Dutch is in Montana for the winter, won't be back until spring," she explained. "The shack's stocked with firewood, and there's a good spring nearby." She pushed the map towards Sarah. "Might be a safer place to hole up than the caves," she suggested. "At least until the baby's stronger." Sarah studied the map, memorizing the landmarks. "Thank you," she said. The words inadequate for what Ada was offering. Ada shrugged. "Just don't get caught," she said. "I'd hate to think I helped you for nothing." Makya had finished the first bottle and was already crying for more. Ada refilled it, and this time the baby drank more slowly. "His desperate hunger easing. He'll need to feed every few hours," Ada said. "I'm giving you 4 bottles and enough goat milk powder to last several days." She showed Sarah how to mix it. "Not as good as fresh, but it'll keep the boy alive," she explained. The night deepened, and Ada insisted they rest, taking turns on watch while the others slept. Sarah collapsed on a pile of blankets and was asleep almost instantly, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. She woke to Ada, shaking her shoulder. The first grey light of dawn visible through the window. "Riders coming," Ada said quietly, her face grim. Sarah was on her feet instantly, her heart hammering. Tanawa was already awake. Makya held close, his expression tense. Ada peered through a gap in the shutters. 3 of them, she reported. Flying crows' colors. She turned to Sarah and Tanawa. "Back room now," she commanded. "There's a storage cellar under the floor. Hidden panel near the far wall." They moved quickly, Sarah grabbing their supplies while Tanawa carried Makya. The back room was cramped and dark, filled with boxes and barrels. Ada showed them the hidden panel, lifting it to reveal a small space beneath. "Get in and stay silent," she said. "I'll handle this." Sarah and Tanawa dropped into the cellar, a space even smaller and darker than the one at Sarah's cabin. The panel closed above them, and they heard Ada dragging something heavy across it, then her footsteps retreating, the sound of the front door opening. A man's voice, rough and demanding. "Morning, Ada. We're looking for a woman and an Indian." Sarah recognized the voice. "Marcus Webb, Crow's brutal lieutenant. Haven't seen anyone," Ada replied, her tone bored. "Been quiet as a graveyard out here. Mind if we look around?" Webb asked. And the false politeness in his voice made Sarah's skin crawl. "I mind plenty," Ada shot back. "But I suppose you'll do it anyway." Heavy boots stomped through the trading post, the sound directly above their heads. Sarah held her breath, pressed against the damp earth wall. Makya stirred, and Tanawa quickly offered him a bottle, the baby latching on with a quiet smack. The boots moved into the back room. Sarah could hear things being moved. Boxes shoved aside, barrels rolled. "What's under here?" Webb's voice. "Right above them, root cellar," Ada replied. "Full of potatoes and onions. Nothing interesting." A pause that stretched like torture. "Open it," Webb commanded. Sarah's hand moved to the pistol Ada had given her. If they were discovered now, in this tiny space with no exit, they'd be trapped like rats. She heard Ada's heavy sigh. "Fine, waste your time," Ada said. And something scraped across the floor. The panel above them shifted. Light began to filter in. Sarah's finger found the trigger, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Tanawa had drawn his knife, his body tensed to spring. The panel lifted another inch, then a shout from outside. "We, Webb! Get out here!" The panel dropped back into place. "What is it?" Webb yelled, clearly annoyed. "Smoke, West Ridge. Looks like a signal." Boots pounded toward the door. "Could be them," Webb's voice excited now. "Mount up." The sound of horses, men shouting, then hoofbeats fading into the distance. Silence. Sarah counted her heartbeats, forcing herself to wait. Finally, the panel lifted and Ada's face appeared. "They're gone," she said, "but that smoke's got them spooked." "They'll be riding hard." Sarah and Tanawa climbed out, their legs shaky. "Was it really a signal?" Sarah asked. Ada shook her head. "Lightning strike, probably. Or maybe a shepherd's cook fire," she said. "But it bought you time." She pushed the supply sack toward them. "You need to leave now," she said urgently. "Oh, while they're chasing ghosts," Sarah nodded, slinging the pack over her shoulder. It was heavier than her old one, filled with Ada's generosity. "How can we ever repay you?" she asked. Ada's expression softened slightly. "Stay alive," she said simply. "That'll be payment enough." She walked them to the door, checked outside carefully. "Coast is clear," she reported. "Head northwest. Stay off the main trails." She pressed the map into Sarah's hand. "Dutch's line shack," she reminded them. 2 days hard travel. "But you'll be safe there." Tanawa nodded, adjusting Makya in his arms. The baby was sleeping peacefully now, fed and warm. Sarah took one last look at the trading post, this island of safety in a hostile world. "Thank you, Ada," she said, "for everything." Ada smiled, a rare expression that transformed her weathered face. "Go on now," she said, "before I start thinking this is a bad idea." They slipped out into the dawn, the air cold and sharp with the promise of the coming storm. Behind them, Ada watched from the doorway until they disappeared into the sage, then closed the door and went back to her normal routine as if nothing had happened. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Sarah and Tanawa moved quickly through the scrubland, putting distance between themselves and the trading post. The sun rose higher, painting the landscape in shades of gold and shadow. They traveled in silence, conserving energy. Tanawa setting a ground-eating pace that Sarah struggled to match. By midday, they'd covered perhaps 8 miles, the terrain growing rougher as they climbed into the foothills. They stopped briefly at a spring to refill their canteen and rest. Sarah mixed more goat milk powder for Makya, who drank eagerly before falling back asleep. "He's stronger," Tanawa observed, relief evident in his voice. Sarah nodded. "Ada's milk is saving his life," she agreed. They sat in companionable silence, eating strips of dried meat and hardtack. Tanawa studied the map Ada had drawn. "We should reach the line shack by tomorrow evening," he said. "If we keep this pace." Sarah's body protested at the thought of another full day of hard travel, but she nodded. "The storm will hit before then," she said, looking at the western sky where dark clouds were building. Tanawa followed her gaze. "We'll need to find shelter," he agreed. "Can't risk the baby in a storm." They pressed on, the afternoon wearing away as they climbed higher into the hills. The landscape changed, sage giving way to juniper and scattered pine. The air grew cooler, carrying the metallic scent of approaching rain. As the sun touched the western peaks, they spotted a small canyon cutting into the hillside. "There," Tanawa pointed. "We can shelter there for the night." They descended into the canyon as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The walls offered some protection, and they found an overhang deep enough to keep them dry. Sarah built a small fire using the matches Ada had provided. While Tanawa fed Makya, the rain intensified, becoming a downpour that drummed against the rocks. Thunder rolled across the hills, and lightning flickered in the darkening sky. But under the overhang, they were dry and relatively warm. Sarah heated water in the tin pot and made a thin gruel from the cornmeal. It wasn't much, but it was hot food, and it felt like luxury. They ate in silence, watching the storm rage beyond their shelter. "Tomorrow we reach the line shack," Sarah said, more to reassure herself than anything. Tanawa nodded. "And then we decide what comes next," he said. Sarah looked at him. This man she'd known for only 2 days, but who she'd risked everything to save. "What do you want to happen next?" she asked. Tanawa stared into the fire, his expression distant. "I want my son to grow up free," he said finally. "Not hunted, not hated, just free." He looked at Sarah. "But I don't know if that's possible anymore," he admitted. "Not in this country. Not with men like Crow making the rules." Sarah understood that despair, had felt it herself more times than she could count. "Maybe not," she agreed, "but we're still here. Still fighting." She fed another stick to the fire. That has to count for something, she said. Tanawa's expression softened. You're a strange woman, Sarah Brennan, he said. But I'm grateful for your strangeness, Sarah smiled. Get some rest, she said. I'll take first watch. Tanawa settled against the canyon wall with Makya cradled in his arms, and within minutes his breathing had deepened into sleep. Sarah sat near the fire, feeding it carefully with small sticks to keep the flames steady but not wasteful. The storm continued its assault on the land beyond their shelter, lightning illuminating the canyon in brief, stark flashes. She found herself thinking about the choices that had led her here. Sitting in a canyon with a Modoc warrior and his baby, running from men who wanted them dead. 2 weeks ago, her biggest concern had been whether her chickens would survive another month. Now she'd abandoned her homestead. Everything Thomas had built, every memory of Emily. But she couldn't bring herself to regret it. When she'd heard Makya crying from beneath the earth, something had shifted inside her. Some wall she'd built around her grief had cracked. Maybe saving this baby couldn't bring Emily back. But it meant something that she'd tried. It meant she was still human, still capable of caring about something beyond her own survival. The fire crackled and popped, sending small showers of sparks into the darkness. Sarah pulled Emily's yellow dress from her pocket. The fabric soft and worn, she held it for a moment, remembering her daughter's laugh, the way she'd twirled in this dress, pretending to be a princess. Then she carefully folded it and tucked it away again. Some memories you carried forever. A sound outside the overhang made her freeze. Not thunder, something else, the scrape of a boot on stone. Sarah's hand went to the pistol at her belt. Her heart suddenly loud in her ears. She stood slowly, moving to the edge of their shelter. Another sound, closer now. Someone was out there in the storm. She cocked the pistol as quietly as she could, the click seeming deafening. A figure emerged from the rain, stumbling. Barely visible in the darkness, Sarah raised the gun. Don't move, she commanded, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. The figure froze, hands slowly rising. Please, a voice said, young and female. I'm not armed. Sarah hesitated. Lightning flashed, and she saw the newcomer clearly for a moment. A girl, maybe 16, soaked to the bone, her dress torn and muddy. Who are you? Sarah demanded, not lowering the gun. My name's Claire, the girl said, her teeth chattering. Claire Donovan, she swayed on her feet. Please, I've been walking for 2 days. I saw your fire, her voice cracked. Behind Sarah, Tanawa was suddenly awake, his knife in hand. What's happening? He asked quietly. Girl in the storm, Sarah replied, not taking her eyes off the stranger. Could be a trap, Tanawa warned. Sarah knew he was right. But looking at Claire's desperate, exhausted face, she saw something of herself. Are you alone? She asked. Claire nodded emphatically. I swear it. I'm running too, she said. Sarah made a decision. Come in slowly, she ordered. Hands where I can see them. Claire stumbled forward into the shelter, and up close Sarah could see she was in bad shape. Her feet were wrapped in bloody rags, her face was bruised, and she moved like someone who'd been beaten. Tanawa moved to the entrance, scanning the darkness for signs of pursuit. I don't see anyone, he reported, but his hand stayed on his knife. Claire collapsed near the fire, shaking violently from cold and exhaustion. Sarah lowered the gun but kept it ready. Who are you running from? She asked. Claire's eyes filled with tears. Fletcher Gaines, she said. And Sarah's stomach dropped. She knew that name. The cattle baron who'd been trying to buy her homestead. Why? Sarah pressed. Claire's face hardened with a bitterness that seemed wrong on someone so young. He killed my father, she said flatly. Claimed our ranch for unpaid debts that didn't exist. She looked up at Sarah with haunted eyes. When I tried to fight him, he said I could work off the debt in his house, she continued, her voice breaking. But it wasn't housework he wanted. Sarah understood immediately and felt sick. So you ran, she said. Claire nodded. 3 days ago. I stole a horse and rode until it collapsed, she said. Then I walked. She gestured to her ruined feet. I didn't know where else to go, she admitted. Tanawa spoke up. Gaines is connected to Crow, he said, his voice grim. They do business together. Sarah's mind raced. If Claire had run from Gaines, his men would be searching. And if they found her with Sarah and Tanawa, it would connect them all. But she couldn't turn away a girl who'd been through what Claire described. "You can shelter here tonight," Sarah said finally. "But come morning we part ways." Claire's face fell. "Please, I have nowhere to go," she begged. "Neither do we," Sarah said bluntly, "and we're being hunted by Crow's men." She met Claire's eyes. "Staying with us will get you killed," she said. Not unkindly, Claire was quiet for a long moment. "I'd rather die free than go back to Gaines," she said finally. Sarah recognized that determination, had felt it herself. She looked at Tanawa, who shrugged slightly. The decision was Sarah's. "One night," Sarah said firmly. "Then you head east toward the settlements." Claire nodded. Seeming to understand, that was the best offer she'd get. Sarah found a blanket in their supplies and handed it to her. "Get warm," she ordered. "There's a little food, if you're hungry." Claire wrapped herself in the blanket gratefully and accepted the hardtack Sarah offered. She ate like someone starving, which she probably was. Tanawa returned to his spot with Makia, but Sarah noticed he kept his knife close. The fire burned lower, and the storm began to ease, the thunder moving east. Claire fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted beyond endurance. Sarah sat watch until dawn, her mind churning with new complications. As grey light filled the canyon, she woke Tanawa. "We need to move," she said quietly. "More people means more chance of being spotted." Tanawa nodded and began gathering their supplies. Claire woke as they were packing, her eyes immediately finding Sarah. "You're leaving," she said. Disappointment clear in her voice. "We have to," Sarah replied. "And so do you." She pulled out Ada's map and showed Claire. "Head east, stay off the main trails," she instructed. "There's a town called Silver Creek about 20 miles that way." She pointed. "Find the sheriff there." "Man named Tom Bradshaw," Sarah continued. "He's honest. He'll help you." Claire took the information, but her expression was doubtful. "What if Gaines finds me first?" she asked. Sarah had no answer for that. "Then you run again," she said finally. "And you keep running until you find someone who'll stand up to him." It wasn't much comfort, but it was the truth. They left the canyon as the sun rose, Claire heading east while Sarah and Tanawa continued northwest. Sarah watched the girl disappear into the landscape, another refugee from the frontier's cruelty. "Do you think she'll make it?" Tanawa asked. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "But at least she has a chance." They walked in silence for a while. The storm-washed landscape clean and bright. Makia woke and fussed for his bottle, and Tanawa fed him while they walked. The baby was definitely stronger. His cries more vigorous, his grip on the bottle firm. "Another day to the line shack," Sarah said, consulting the map. "If we don't run into trouble," Tanawa added. Sarah smiled grimly. "When have we not run into trouble?" she replied. But for once, luck seemed to be with them. They traveled through the day without incident. Covering good ground, the terrain grew more rugged. Pine forests replacing the scrubland, the air cooler and cleaner. As evening approached, they spotted smoke rising from a small valley ahead. Sarah's hand went to her pistol. "The line shack," Tanawa said, pointing to a small structure barely visible among the trees. They approached cautiously, but the place appeared deserted except for the smoke from what must be a recent fire. The shack was rough but solid. A single room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping platform, and supplies stacked against the wall. Someone had been here recently. The fire still had warm coals. Sarah and Tanawa exchanged wary glances. Then a voice spoke from the shadows. "Well now, looks like Dutch's place is popular this season." A man stepped into the light, old and grizzled, with a shotgun cradled casually in his arms. "Name's Caleb," he said, "and you'd better have a damn good reason for being here." The old man named Caleb stood in the doorway of Dutch Keller's line shack with his shotgun leveled at Sarah and Tanawa, his weathered face unreadable in the fading light. Sarah's hand moved toward her pistol, but stopped when Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. "This guy—" "I wouldn't," he said mildly, his voice carrying the gravel of too many years and too much whiskey. Tanawa shifted Makia to one arm, his other hand empty and visible. "We mean no harm," he said carefully. "Ada Whitfield Center said the shack would be empty." Caleb's bushy eyebrows rose at Ada's name. "Ada sent you," he repeated, lowering the shotgun slightly. "Well, that changes things some." He studied them more carefully, his sharp eyes taking in Sarah's exhausted face, Tanawa's protective stance, and the baby sleeping against the warrior's chest. "You're the ones Crow's hunting," he said, not a question. Sarah saw no point in lying. "Yes," she admitted. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured with the shotgun. "Get in before someone sees the light," he ordered, "and close the damn door." They entered cautiously, Sarah keeping her hand near her weapon. The interior was warmer than expected, the fire in the stone fireplace crackling merrily. Caleb had clearly been here for a while. His bedroll was spread on the sleeping platform, and a pot of something that smelled like stew bubbled over the fire. "Sit," Caleb commanded, propping his shotgun against the wall but keeping it within reach. He was old, probably 70, with a face like cracked leather and hands that trembled slightly with age or drink. But his eyes were sharp and calculating. "So you're the widow who dug up Crow's victims," he said, settling onto a three-legged stool. "Heard about that. Whole territory's buzzing with the story." He looked at Tanawa. "And you're the Modoc who was supposed to suffocate in the ground with your boy," he continued. "Crow's offering $100 now. Raised the bounty yesterday." Sarah's stomach dropped. $100 was enough money to make even honest people consider betrayal. Caleb must have seen her expression because he chuckled. A dry sound like wind through dead leaves. "Don't worry, girl," he said. "I ain't turning you in." He stirred the pot over the fire. "I'm here because I'm hiding too," he admitted, though from debts and bad decisions rather than murder charges. He ladled stew into tin bowls and handed them over. "Eat," he said. "You both look like death warmed over." Sarah accepted the bowl gratefully, the smell of meat and vegetables making her stomach growl. They ate in silence, Caleb watching them with open curiosity. Makia woke and began fussing, and Sarah prepared a bottle while Tanawa held him. "Baby needs real milk," Caleb observed. "Goat's milk powder will keep him alive, but he needs the real thing to thrive." "We know," Sarah said quietly. "But we're doing the best we can," Caleb nodded. "Seeming to accept this, how long you planning to stay?" he asked. Sarah and Tanawa exchanged glances. "We thought the place would be empty," Sarah said. "Ada told us Dutch was in Montana." "He is," Caleb confirmed, "but Dutch and I go back 40 years. He lets me use his places when I need to disappear." He refilled his own bowl. "Problem is, Crow's men patrol through here every few days," he continued. "They haven't bothered me yet, because I'm just a harmless old drunk. But if they find you here," he left the implication hanging. Tanawa spoke up. "We'll leave at first light," he said. "Head deeper into the lava beds." Caleb shook his head. "That's suicide with a baby," he said bluntly. "The lava beds in winter will kill you faster than Crow." He thought for a moment, chewing slowly. "There might be another way," he said finally. "But it's risky and you'd have to trust me." Sarah's instinct screamed caution. They'd been lucky so far with Ada, but trusting a self-proclaimed drunk they'd just met seemed foolish. "What way?" she asked carefully. Caleb leaned forward, his voice dropping. "There's a freight wagon heading to Sacramento in 3 days, he explained. "Leaves from Willow Creek, about 30 miles west." He met Sarah's eyes. "Driver's name is Joseph Chen, a Chinese man who hauls goods for the mining camps," he continued. "Joseph owes me a favor, a big one. And he's no friend of Crow." Sarah's mind raced. Sacramento meant safety, meant disappearing into a city where nobody cared about frontier feuds. "Why would he help us?" she asked. Caleb's expression darkened. "Because Crow's men burned his first wagon and beat him near to death 2 years back," he said. "Claimed he was hauling opium when all he had was tea and rice." He spat into the fire. "Joseph's been waiting for a chance to stick it to Crow," he said. "Helping you escape would do that nicely." Tanawa studied the old man. "And what do you gain from this?" he asked. Caleb smiled, showing gaps where teeth used to be. The satisfaction of watching Crow lose something he wants, he said simply, and maybe clearing my conscience a little. He stood and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a bottle of whiskey. I've done things I'm not proud of, he admitted. Taking a long drink, turned a blind eye when I should have spoken up, took money when I should have refused. He looked at them. Maybe helping you makes up for some of that, he said. Sarah wanted to believe him, but trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. How do we know you're not leading us into a trap? She challenged. Caleb shrugged. You don't, he said honestly. But consider your options. He ticked them off on his gnarled fingers. Stay here and wait for Crow to find you. Head into the lava beds and freeze to death, or take a chance on getting to California. He was right, and Sarah knew it. 3 days, she said. We'd have to hide here for 3 days. In the root cellar, Caleb said, pointing to a trapdoor Sarah hadn't noticed. It's bigger than it looks. Stocked with supplies. He took another drink. I'll tell anyone who asks that I'm alone, he continued. You stay quiet and out of sight, and when the time comes, I'll get you to Joseph's wagon. Tanawa looked at Sarah, the decision clearly hers to make. She thought about everything that had brought them here, all the impossible choices and desperate gambles. All right, she said finally. We'll trust you. Caleb nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. Good, he said. Now get some rest. Tomorrow I'll show you the cellar properly. That night Sarah took first watch again, sitting by the fire while Caleb snored on his bedroll and Tenawa slept with Makya. She stared into the flames and wondered if they'd made the right choice. Trust had gotten people killed on the frontier, but so had paranoia. Sometimes you had to take a leap of faith and hope the ground would be there when you landed. Morning came cold and clear, frost glittering on the pine needles outside. Caleb was up early, despite his drinking, cooking bacon and cornmeal mush over the fire. They ate quickly, and then he showed them the root cellar. It was accessed through a trapdoor, hidden under a bearskin rug, descending into a space about 10 feet square and 6 feet deep. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods, dried meat and other supplies. Dutch uses it for winter storage, Caleb explained. But it'll hide you well enough. He'd rigged a small oil lamp that could be shuttered to hide the light. Keep this dark during the day, he warned. Only light it at night when the shutters are closed. Sarah climbed down with their supplies, while Tanawa handed Makya down to her. The space was cramped but livable, and most importantly, it was hidden. I'll bring you food and water twice a day, Caleb said from above, and I'll warn you if anyone comes around. He started to close the trap door, then paused. For what it's worth, he said. I think what you did was brave, digging them out. Then the door closed and they were in darkness. Sarah lit the lamp cautiously, the small flame casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. 3 days, she said to Tanawa. We can manage 3 days. The first day passed slowly. They took turns sleeping and caring for Makya, who was growing stronger with each feeding. The baby had started to smile, a toothless grin that made Sarah's heart ache with memories of Emily. Caleb brought them meals as promised, knocking 3 times before opening the trapdoor. He reported that the area was quiet. No sign of Crow's men. The second day was harder. The confined space pressed on them, and Makya grew fussy from lack of stimulation. Sarah paced the small cellar, counting steps to keep from going mad. Tanawa sat cross-legged, teaching Makya a Modoc lullaby in a voice so soft Sarah barely heard it. That evening, Caleb's knock came earlier than usual, sharper, more urgent. He opened the trapdoor with his face tense. Riders coming, he hissed. 5 of them. Crow's men for sure. Sarah's blood ran cold. Stay absolutely silent, Caleb commanded. I'll handle them. The door closed, and they heard him dragging the bearskin rug back into place. Tanawa extinguished the lamp immediately. They sat in absolute darkness. Sarah holding Makya while Tanawa positioned himself to fight if necessary. Hoofbeats approached, then stopped outside. Heavy boots on the wooden porch. Caleb, you old bastard. You in there? A voice called. Sarah recognized it Marcus Webb. The door opened and Boots stomped into the shack. "What do you want, Webb?" Caleb's voice. "Annoyed but not afraid. Looking for a woman and an Indian," Webb said. "Word is they might be heading this way." Sarah's heart hammered so loud she was certain they could hear it. Makya stirred in her arms, and she pressed him gently to her chest, praying he wouldn't cry. "Ain't seen nobody," Caleb said. "You've been here 3 days and haven't had a visitor until you showed up." "Mind if we look around?" Webb asked. And Sarah heard the threat beneath the false politeness. "Help yourself," Caleb replied. "Ain't got nothing to hide." Boots moved through the small space directly above their heads. Sarah could hear things being moved, cabinets opened. "What's under this rug?" Webb's voice. "Closer now. Root cellar," Caleb said, sounding bored. "Full of turnips and potatoes. Help yourself if you're hungry." A long pause. Sarah's hand found her pistol. If they opened the trap door, she'd have one chance to shoot before they killed them all. "Nah," Webb said finally. "Ain't that desperate yet?" More sounds of searching, then the Boots moved toward the door. "You see anyone, you let us know," Webb ordered. "There's $100 in it." "Sure thing," Caleb agreed easily. The door closed. Hoofbeats faded. Sarah counted to 100 before allowing herself to breathe normally. They waited in the darkness for what felt like hours before Caleb's 3-knock signal came. He opened the trapdoor, his face pale in the lamplight. "That was too damn close," he said, his hand shaking as he took a drink from his flask. "They're searching in a grid pattern," he continued. Covering every building, every camp, he looked at Sarah and Tanawa. "We move up the timeline," he said. "I'll get word to Joseph tonight. You leave tomorrow at dawn." "Is that safe?" Sarah asked. Caleb laughed without humor. "Nothing about this is safe," he said. "But staying here another 2 days is suicide." He was right. "Tomorrow then," Sarah agreed. That night none of them slept much. Caleb disappeared for several hours, presumably to contact Joseph Chen. When he returned, his clothes were muddy and he looked exhausted. "It's arranged," he said. "Joseph will meet you at Broken Mesa, about 5 miles west of here." He handed Sarah a crude map. "Be there by noon," he instructed. "Joseph can't wait. He's on a schedule." Tanawa studied the map. 5 miles through open country, he observed. "In daylight, can't be helped," Caleb said. "The mesa's the only place his wagon route goes that's got cover for a pickup." He pulled out supplies from his cabinet, packing them into a sack. "Food for a week, ammunition, matches," he listed. "Everything I can spare." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Caleb, we can't repay you for this," she said. The old man waved her off. "I told you." "This clears my conscience," he said, but his eyes were sad. "Besides," he added with a crooked smile, "I'm too old to spend this money anyway." They prepared to leave before dawn, gathering their meager possessions. Caleb walked them to the edge of the tree line as the first grey light touched the sky. "Stay off the main trails," he advised. "And if you see riders, hide first, run second." He looked at Makya, sleeping peacefully in Tanawa's arms. "Take care of that boy," he said gruffly. "He's got a hell of a story to tell someday." Tanawa nodded. "We won't forget this," he said. Caleb shrugged. "Just make it to California," he replied. "That'll be thanks enough." They left him standing there in the dawn light, a lonely figure returning to his hiding place. The journey to Broken Mesa was nerve-wracking. Every bird's flight, every rustle of wind through sage made Sarah's hand go to her pistol. They moved quickly but carefully, using every bit of cover the landscape offered. Twice they had to dive behind rocks when riders appeared in the distance, but luck was with them. And by late morning, they spotted the distinctive shape of Broken Mesa rising from the plain. It was well named, a geological formation that looked like it had been split by some ancient force. A narrow canyon cut through it, just wide enough for a wagon. They scrambled up the rocky slope and waited in the shadows. Noon came and went. Sarah began to worry that Joseph wouldn't show, that they'd been betrayed. Then she heard it, the creak of wagon wheels and the plod of horses. A freight wagon appeared, loaded with crates and barrels, pulled by 4 sturdy horses. The driver was indeed Chinese. middle-aged with a queue down his back and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years on the road. He guided the wagon into the canyon and stopped. "Caleb's friends," he called out in accented English. "Show yourselves." Sarah and Tanawa emerged from their hiding spot. Joseph Chen looked them over with quick, assessing eyes. "Get in quick," he ordered, gesturing to the back of the wagon, under the tarp, behind the rice sacks. They climbed aboard, and Joseph showed them a space he'd created, just big enough for 2 adults and a baby. "Stay quiet no matter what," he warned. "I get stopped sometimes. They search sometimes." He covered them with the heavy canvas tarp, then rearranged the cargo to hide them completely. The wagon lurched into motion, and Sarah found herself in hot, airless darkness, pressed against sacks of rice with Tanawa beside her and Makia between them. 3 days to Sacramento," Tanawa whispered. Sarah closed her eyes and prayed they'd make it. The wagon rolled westward through the afternoon. Each jolt and bump transmitted through the hard wooden bed beneath them. The space was cramped and stifling, the canvas tarp trapping heat like an oven. Makia began to fuss, uncomfortable in the airless darkness. Sarah prepared a bottle as quietly as possible, the baby's hungry cries muffled against Tanawa's chest. They fed him in shifts, taking turns holding him, trying to keep him calm and quiet. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah's legs cramped from being folded in the same position, and her back ached from the constant jolting. She could hear Joseph up front, occasionally talking to his horses in a mixture of English and Chinese. The rhythm of the wagon became hypnotic, lulling her into an uncomfortable half-sleep. She was jolted awake when the wagon suddenly stopped, voices outside, rough and demanding. "Hold up there, Chinaman," someone called. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Beside her, Tanawa had gone absolutely still, his hand on his knife. "What you hauling?" the voice demanded. "Rice, tea, mining supplies," Joseph replied calmly. "Same as always." "We're looking for fugitives," another voice said. "Indian man and a white woman with a baby." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "I haven't seen anyone," Joseph said. "Been on the road since dawn. Just me and my horses." Footsteps approached the wagon. "Mind if we look?" the first voice asked, and it wasn't really a question. "Help yourself," Joseph replied, his voice betraying no tension. The tarp was yanked back, sunlight flooded in, blinding after the darkness. Sarah pressed herself flat against the rice sacks, Tanawa covering Makia completely with his body. They'd stacked the cargo carefully, creating a false back that looked like the end of the load. "Just what he said," one of the men reported. "Rice and tea, check behind those sacks," another voice ordered. Sarah's hand found her pistol. Rough hands grabbed the nearest rice sack, pulling, then Joseph's voice sharp and angry. "Careful with that, you break it, you buy it," he snapped. "But that rice costs money." "Shut up, Chinaman," the man growled. But he was more careful as he moved sacks. He was getting closer to their hiding spot. One more sack and they'd be exposed. Makia chose that moment to whimper. The sound was tiny, almost inaudible beneath the noise of the men searching. But the searcher paused. "You hear that?" he asked. Sarah held her breath, her finger on the trigger. "Hear what?" his companion replied. "Sounded like a baby crying." "You're hearing things," the other man said. "Probably a bird or something." The first man stood there for a long moment, so close Sarah could smell tobacco and sweat. Then he moved back. "Ain't nothing here," he called out. "Just a wagon full of rice." The tarp dropped back into place, plunging them into darkness again. "Move along," one of the men ordered. The wagon lurched forward, and Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. That had been too close. They traveled until full dark before Joseph stopped for the night. He pulled off the main road into a small grove of trees, and only then did he uncover them. "Out," he said quietly. "Stretch your legs while I make camp." Sarah climbed out stiffly, her legs barely holding her. The cool evening air felt like heaven after the stifling heat under the tarp. Tanawa handed Makia to her and climbed out himself. Moving slowly like an old man, Joseph was already building a small fire, keeping it low and sheltered. "That was Crow's men," he said, not looking at them. "They're checking every wagon on every road." He set a pot of water to boil. "We got lucky," he continued. They were lazy, didn't search thoroughly. He finally looked at them. Tomorrow they might be more careful, he warned. Sarah fed Makya, while Joseph made a simple meal of rice and dried fish. They ate in silence, all three of them exhausted. How much farther to Sacramento? Sarah asked. Joseph studied the stars. 2 more days if we don't run into trouble, he said. Maybe 3, he poked at the fire. Caleb said you saved this man and his son from being buried alive, he continued. Looking at Tanawa, Sarah nodded. Joseph's expression was unreadable. Crow's men beat me and burned my wagon because I was Chinese, he said quietly. Said I didn't belong here, that this was white man's country. He met Sarah's eyes. You risked everything to save a Modoc man and his child, he continued. That takes courage most people don't have. He stood and began banking the fire. We'll make it to Sacramento, he said with quiet determination. I promise you that they took turns keeping watch that night. Sarah, taking the midnight shift, she sat by the dying fire, watching the stars wheel overhead. They'd come so far from that day she'd heard Makya crying beneath the earth. 3 weeks that felt like 3 years. She'd lost her home, her safety, everything familiar. But she'd gained something too, something she couldn't quite name. Purpose, maybe. Or just the knowledge that she could still care about something beyond her own survival. Tanawa's voice startled her from her thoughts. You should sleep, he said, settling beside her with Makya in his arms. Can't, Sarah admitted. Too many thoughts. Tanawa nodded, understanding. When we reach Sacramento, he said slowly. What will you do? Sarah realized she hadn't thought that far ahead. I don't know, she admitted. Find work, I suppose. Start over, she looked at him. What about you, she asked. Tanawa was quiet for a long moment. My people are on the reservation, he said, but I can't go there. Not with Crow still hunting me. He adjusted Makya in his arms. Maybe Sacramento is far enough, he continued. Maybe we can disappear into the city. Raise my son in peace. The way he said we made Sarah's breath catch. You want me to stay? She asked carefully. Tanawa met her eyes. Makya needs a mother, he said simply. And you've been more mother to him than anyone since Wenatchee died. He paused. But more than that, he continued, you've become family. The only family either of us has left. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know how to be part of a family anymore, she admitted. I lost mine, forgot how... Tanawa's hand found hers in the darkness. We'll figure it out together, he said. They sat in companionable silence until dawn. The second day of travel was harder. Word of their escape had spread, and Joseph reported seeing wanted posters in the small towns they passed. $100 for information leading to the capture of Sarah Brennan and the Modoc fugitive Tanawa. They stayed hidden under the tarp all day, the heat unbearable, Makya increasingly fussy. Joseph stopped twice for inspections, each time Sarah's heart in her throat. But their luck held. That night Joseph pushed on after dark, trying to make up time. The wagon rolled through the darkness, and beneath the tarp, Sarah held Makya and wondered if they'd really make it. The third morning broke clear and cold. Joseph woke them early. Sacramento by nightfall, he announced. If we don't stop, his face was tense. There's a checkpoint on the main road into the city, he explained. They'll search the wagon thoroughly. Sarah's stomach dropped. So what do we do? She asked. Joseph pulled out a map. There's another way in, he said, pointing through the Chinese Quarter. Smaller roads, less watched. He looked at them seriously. But it's risky, he warned. If we're caught trying to sneak in, they'll assume we're smuggling. Tanawa studied the map. The checkpoint is certain discovery, he said. The back way is only possible discovery. He looked at Sarah. We take the risk, she agreed. Joseph nodded and guided the wagon onto smaller roads. The terrain grew more populated as they approached the city. Sarah could hear voices, smell cooking fires, sense the presence of civilization after weeks in the wilderness. It felt both comforting and terrifying. The wagon slowed, threading through narrow streets. Stay quiet, Joseph whispered. Almost there, finally. After what felt like hours, the wagon stopped. Joseph pulled back the tarp. "Welcome to Sacramento," he said with a tired smile. Sacramento, in the autumn of 1873, sprawled before them like a promise, its streets crowded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Joseph Chen led Sarah and Tanawa through the Chinese Quarter to a small room above a noodle shop, barely 8 feet square with a single window. "It's not much," Joseph admitted, setting down a basket of supplies. "But my cousin owns the building and won't ask questions." Sarah looked around their new refuge. "Cramped but safe. How can we thank you?" she asked. Joseph shook his head. "Just stay alive," he said. "That'll be thanks enough." After he left, Sarah and Tanawa stood in silence, the weight of their journey settling on them. The city sounds below were alien and overwhelming, nothing like the wind and space of the frontier, but here they could disappear. Morning brought the harsh reality of survival. Sarah found work at a textile mill, 10 brutal hours a day for $1.50 per week. It was poverty wages, but it was something. Tanawa stayed hidden with Makia, teaching his son Modic words, keeping their culture alive in whispers. 2 weeks passed in grinding sameness. Sarah's fingers bled from the rough thread, her back ached constantly, and their money barely covered food and rent. Then one evening she returned to find Tanawa gone, and a note beside Makia, "Gone to find work, back by dark." Sarah paced in panic until midnight when Tanawa returned, holding $3 silver. "Dock work," he explained. "Night shifts, cash, no questions." The pride in his eyes stopped her protests. 3 months passed. Between their wages, they built something resembling a life. Warmer clothes for Makia, better food, even savings. The cramped room became home. Sarah made cautious friends at the mill. Tanawa earned respect on the docks, and Makia grew strong, babbling in 2 languages. They began to believe in their future. Then one rainy February evening, Sarah came home to find Tanawa at the window, his body rigid. "Bounty hunters," he said quietly, pointing to 2 men watching from the alley below. Sarah's blood turned to ice. 3 months of peace shattered in an instant. "We run tonight," Tanawa decided. They packed quickly, taking only essentials. $30 saved. Food, Makia's clothes, Sarah's pistol. Everything else stayed behind. Past midnight, as the hunters moved toward the entrance, they slipped out the back window. Sarah's heart hammered as she edged along the narrow ledge with Makia strapped to her chest. Behind them, boots thundered up the stairs. Tanawa dropped first, catching Sarah as she jumped. They ran through the rain-slicked streets, leaving Sacramento behind. Behind them, a shout of discovery. The chase was on again. But Sarah found she wasn't afraid. They'd survived the desert, the manhunt, the impossible journey. They'd survived this too. Together they always would. They moved through the dark streets with practiced efficiency. Tanawa, leading them through alleys and side streets he'd learned during his months of dock work. The rain was both blessing and curse, muffling their footsteps but also making the cobblestones treacherous. Sarah slipped twice, catching herself before she fell with Makia. The baby, sensing the urgency, stayed remarkably quiet, his dark eyes wide and watchful. Behind them, more shouts, the sound of running feet. The bounty hunters had reinforcements. Tanawa pulled Sarah into a narrow gap between buildings, pressing them both flat against the wall. 3 men ran past, their boots splashing through puddles, rifles in hand. Sarah held her breath until they'd passed. "The river," Tanawa whispered. "We can lose them in the warehouses." They emerged from their hiding spot and ran toward the waterfront. The Sacramento River ran dark and swollen with winter rain. The docks stretched along its banks, massive warehouses looming like sleeping giants. Tanawa led them into the maze of loading bays and stacked crates. This was his territory. He knew every hiding spot, every route through the industrial labyrinth. They ducked behind a pile of grain sacks as lanterns appeared behind them. "Spread out," a voice commanded. They came this way. Sarah recognized that voice. It had haunted her nightmares. Marcus Webb. Somehow Crow's lieutenant had tracked them all the way to Sacramento. "He's persistent," Tanawa muttered, echoing her thoughts. They moved deeper into the warehouse district. always staying ahead of the searching men, but Webb was methodical. His men covering every exit, they were being herded, pushed toward the river's edge. Tanawa realized it at the same moment Sarah did. "Trap," he said grimly. They emerged from between two warehouses and found themselves on a dock with nowhere left to run. The river churned below them, cold and dangerous. Behind them, lantern light approached. Marcus Webb appeared with 4 men, all armed, all looking triumphant. "End of the line," Webb called out, his voice carrying over the rain. "Nowhere left to run. Mrs. Brennan." He stepped closer, his rifle aimed at Sarah's chest. "That baby's worth $50 to me," he said. "The Indian's worth another 50. He smiled without warmth. "But you're special," he continued. "Crow wants you alive, wants to make an example." Sarah's hand moved toward her pistol. "Don't," Webb warned. "You pull that gun and we shoot the Indian first. Then the baby." Sarah froze. Tanawa stood beside her, his body tense, calculating odds. 4 men with rifles against 1 knife and Sarah's pistol. The mathematics were brutal. "Smart choice," Webb said, gesturing to his men. "Take them." The bounty hunters moved forward. Then a voice rang out from the darkness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Everyone turned. Joseph Chen emerged from behind a stack of crates, and he wasn't alone. A dozen Chinese workers stood with him, all armed with dock hooks, clubs, and a few with rifles. "These people are under my protection," Joseph said calmly. "You'll have to go through us." Webb's face twisted with fury. "This isn't your fight, Chinaman," he snarled. "You made it my fight when you burned my wagon," Joseph replied, his voice cold as the rain. He stepped forward, and the workers moved with him. "Now you have a choice," Joseph continued. "Leave peacefully, or we throw you in the river." The dock workers looked very willing to do exactly that. Webb's men shifted nervously, suddenly aware they were outnumbered. "Crow will hear about this," Webb threatened. "Good," Joseph said. "Tell him Joseph Chen says to stay out of my district." Webb stared at them for a long moment, his hand tight on his rifle. Then he spat and gestured to his men. "This ain't over," he promised, backing toward the street. "Yes, it is," Joseph said firmly. "They're under protection now. Anyone who touches them answers to all of us." Webb and his men disappeared into the rain. Sarah's legs nearly buckled with relief. Joseph approached, concern on his weathered face. "I heard bounty hunters asking questions," he explained. "Figured they might be looking for you." He looked at the workers who'd come with him. "These men, they're tired of people like Crow and Webb," he said. "Tired of being pushed around, tired of watching injustice." One of the workers, a young man with fierce eyes, spoke up. "We heard what you did, digging them out of the ground," he said in accented English. "That takes courage." Another worker nodded. "We stand with courage," he said simply. Sarah felt tears mixing with the rain on her face. "Thank you," she managed to say. Joseph smiled. "Come," he said. "We have a safe place." Truly safe this time. He led them through the district to a building Sarah hadn't seen before. It looked like a warehouse from the outside, but inside it had been converted into a community center. Families lived on the upper floors, children playing despite the late hour. "This is our place," Joseph explained, "built by our community, protected by our community." He showed them to a small apartment on the 3rd floor. It was simple but clean, with real furniture and windows that actually locked. "You'll be safe here," he promised. "Webb won't dare come into this building." Sarah looked around the space, hardly daring to believe it. After months of running, hiding, constantly looking over their shoulders, could they finally stop? Tanawa seemed to be thinking the same thing. "How can we repay this?" he asked Joseph. The freight hauler shook his head. "Live," he said simply. "Raise your son. Be happy. That's payment enough." He moved toward the door. "Besides," he added with a slight smile, "you're part of our community now. We protect our own." After he left, Sarah and Tanawa stood in their new home, Makya finally asleep in Sarah's arms. "Do you think it's really over?" Sarah asked quietly. Tanawa was silent for a long moment. "Maybe not forever," he said finally. "But for now, yes." He looked at her. "We've found something rare," he continued. People willing to stand together against injustice. Sarah nodded, understanding. They'd survived because people like Ada, Caleb, and Joseph had chosen courage over profit, had chosen to help rather than look away. "Tomorrow we start building a real life," she said. Tanawa smiled, a genuine expression she'd rarely seen. "Tomorrow," he agreed. And every day after, they ran through rain-slicked streets toward the waterfront, shouts echoing behind them. Tanawa led Sarah through the maze of warehouses he knew from dock work, always staying ahead of their pursuers. But the bounty hunters were methodical, cutting off escape routes, herding them toward the river. They emerged on a dock with nowhere left to run, the Sacramento River churning dark and dangerous below. Marcus Webb appeared with 4 armed men, his rifle aimed at Sarah's chest. "End of the line," he called out, rain dripping from his hat. Sarah's hand moved toward her pistol. "Don't," Webb warned. "You pull that gun and we shoot the Indian first. Then the baby." She froze, calculating impossible odds. 4 rifles against 1 pistol and Tanawa's knife. "Smart choice," Webb said, gesturing to his men. "Take them." Then a voice rang from the darkness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Joseph Chen emerged from behind stacked crates. And he wasn't alone. A dozen Chinese dock workers stood with him, armed with hooks, clubs, and rifles. "These people are under my protection," Joseph said calmly, Webb's face twisted with fury. "This isn't your fight, Chinaman," he snarled. "You made it my fight when you burned my wagon," Joseph replied coldly. He stepped forward, workers moving with him. "Now leave peacefully, or we throw you in the river." The dock workers looked very willing to do exactly that. Webb's men shifted nervously, suddenly outnumbered. "Crow will hear about this," Webb threatened, backing away. "Good," Joseph said. "Tell him to stay out of my district." Webb and his men disappeared into the rain. Defeated, Sarah's legs nearly buckled with relief. Joseph approached, concern on his weathered face. "I heard bounty hunters asking questions," he explained. "Figured they might be looking for you," he gestured to the workers. "We're tired of men like Crow and Webb," one said in accented English. "Tired of injustice," another nodded. "You dug them out of the ground when others would have walked away," he continued. "That takes courage," Joseph smiled. "Come," he said. "We have a truly safe place this time." He led them to a building that looked like a warehouse, but housed families on the upper floors. "This is our community center," Joseph explained, "built by us, protected by us." He showed them to a small apartment on the 3rd floor. "Simple but secure. Webb won't dare come here," he promised. After Joseph left, Sarah and Tanawa stood in their new home, hardly daring to believe it. "Do you think it's really over?" Sarah asked quietly. Tanawa was silent for a long moment. "Maybe not forever," he said finally, "but for now." "Yes," he looked at her with something profound in his eyes. "We found people willing to stand against injustice," he continued. "That's rare." Sarah nodded, understanding. They'd survived because people like Ada, Caleb, and Joseph chose courage over profit. The next morning, Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through clean windows. For the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. Makia babbled happily, playing with a wooden toy one of the community children had given him. Tanawa was already up, standing at the window. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked. He turned to her. "That my son will grow up here," he said, "safe, with a community that protects its own." He paused. "And that he'll know his mother was brave enough to dig a stranger from the earth," he continued. Sarah's breath caught. "His mother, Tanawa," she started. "Wenachi gave me Makia," he interrupted gently. "But you gave him life when the world tried to take it." He took her hand. "If you'll have us," he said, "truly have us. As family." Sarah looked at this man she'd saved, who'd become so much more than a stranger, at the baby she'd clawed from the ground, who now called for her with reaching arms. "Yes," she said simply. Over the following weeks, they built a life in ways Sarah had never imagined. She found better work in a dress shop where the owner valued skill over desperation. Tanawa worked openly at the docks, protected by the community that claimed him as one of their own. Makia thrived, growing strong and happy, learning songs in 3 languages. Joseph became like family, joining them for meals. Teaching Makia to count in Chinese, the community embraced them fully, proof that courage created its own family. One evening, 3 months later, Sarah received a letter forwarded through Ada Whitfield. Her hands shook as she opened it. It was from a lawyer in Lakeview. Silas Crowe had been arrested for multiple murders. His militia disbanded, his bounty hunters scattered. Fletcher Gaines faced federal charges for land theft and other crimes. The lawyer wrote that Sarah's homestead still stood if she wanted to return. She read the letter twice, then handed it to Tanawa. He read in silence. "Do you want to go back?" he asked carefully. Sarah looked around their small apartment, at the community center where children played below, at Makia sleeping peacefully in his cradle, at Tanawa, this man who'd become her partner in all things. "No," she said firmly. "I'm already home." She moved to the window, watching the street below. "That land was my past," she continued. "This is our future." Tanawa stood beside her. "Then we build it together," he said. Sarah thought about the day she'd heard a baby crying from beneath the earth, how she'd made an impossible choice that changed everything. She'd lost her homestead, her old life, everything familiar. But she'd gained a family, a community, a purpose beyond mere survival. The frontier had tried to bury compassion along with Tanawa and Makia. But Sarah had dug it back up, and in doing so, she'd unearthed her own redemption. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.